Hello, everyone. The strikes by the United States and Israel against Iran have now entered their fourth week. Yesterday, news came out that the U.S. and Iran are trying to restart negotiations through third-party talks. Today, the media revealed more details about the negotiations. Today, at a press conference, Trump gave the latest update, saying this is the current situation. He said the people we're talking to now are a completely different group. They even just sent us a big gift. All right, let's talk about this next. So what's really going on with the U.S.-Iran negotiations? Before we get into it, just a quick reminder, if you like our show but haven't subscribed yet, please remember to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our latest daily updates. Today, Trump said that Iran gave us a big gift. It just arrived today, and it's worth a lot of money. It's related to oil and gas. A reporter asked if it was related to the Strait of Hormuz, and Trump said yes. Trump also said that this shows the people we're negotiating with right now. It's different from before. In a way, this is also a regime change. Trump also said that Iran agreed not to pursue nuclear weapons. So what kind of big gift is it? I saw some reports saying that Iran agreed to give the U.S. 5% of its oil and natural gas sales as payment in gold. This is exactly what I saw reported. This rumor, well, I don't know if it's true, but either way, Iran is giving oil and gas to the U.S. That's a huge gift. This sounds absolutely shocking. It seems completely different from Iran's usual tough stance in the past. If this is really the case, then it's pretty interesting to think about what kind of people Trump and his team are negotiating with right now. There are also reports saying that the U.S. and Iran might have direct face-to-face negotiations. This could possibly happen this Thursday in Pakistan. But it's still unknown who exactly will represent Iran. I think there are two possible unknowns here. One is that the Iranian side hasn't decided yet, and the other possibility is that the media just doesn't know. Because if the negotiation counterpart, if it's not, as the media claims, Iran's Speaker of Parliament or even Iran's foreign minister, then it's possible that it's a mysterious third party, If they don't want the outside world to know and Trump hasn't revealed it either, then it's very likely the media just doesn't know. So who exactly is this third party? I think it's hard to say, but personally, I believe there's a possibility. We'll talk about that later in the show. But earlier, Reuters reported that 3 senior Iranian sources revealed, although Trump has publicly claimed that both sides have already engaged in very strong negotiations, in reality, things are still at the stage of indirect message exchanges. In other words, they haven't actually entered into substantive face-to-face negotiations. At present, Iran has only had discussions with Pakistan, Turkey, and Egypt. These were just preliminary contacts to explore the situation. Is there a foundation for negotiations with the United States? A European official also confirmed that although there hasn't been direct dialogue, the mediation channels have already been activated. Reuters reports that if negotiations really do begin, Iran would send Speaker Khalibaf and Foreign Minister Araghchi to attend. But the final decision-making power still rests with the hardliners. It's in the hands of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This was according to Reuters. However, I think it might not necessarily be like that. It could also be different people negotiating. So it really all depends on this. After this information is finally revealed, what kind of negotiating party will it actually be? At the same time, the Wall Street Journal also reported that President Trump postponed his ultimatum for this reason. He paused the strikes. The action against Iran's power plant was because U.S. officials received information from Arab mediators. They got word from there that a possible agreement could be reached, according to reports. Last Thursday, the foreign ministers of Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan gathered in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, for talks. Basically, they're hoping to find a diplomatic solution to the Iran war. These mediators also privately conveyed messages from the Iranian side to the United States. And they arranged a series of informal contacts. So after these contacts and closed-door discussions, Trump decided to hold off on the strike and give diplomacy another chance, a chance to resolve things diplomatically. There's an Israeli media outlet called New Message News, which quoted Iranian sources. According to their report, Iranian Foreign Minister Iraqi and U.S. Envoy Witkoff had a secret phone call last Thursday. And during the call, he told Witkoff that Iran's newest supreme leader, the newly appointed supreme leader, Mujtaba Khamenei, has already agreed to enter into negotiations. However, both the Arab mediators and Israeli officials are now expressing doubts about whether the US and Iran can quickly reach an agreement. As for the Israeli officials, they were interviewed by the Jerusalem Post. Israeli officials believe that an agreement between the US and Iran is very slim. They also stated that there have been no changes in coordination with the US military or in operational plans. In fact, judging from media reports, there are indeed demands being put forward by both the US and Iran at the moment. The major condition from the US, just like before the war, is to completely dismantle the nuclear program, which is absolutely unacceptable. Additionally, the US demands that Iran give up nuclear weapons, suspend its ballistic missile program, and stop supporting proxy militias. On the other hand, Iran's demands seem even tougher. According to 3 Iranian sources cited by Reuters, Iran has put forward 4 core demands for entering negotiations. First, they want security guarantees to protect them from attacks by the US or Israel. Second, compensation for losses caused by the war. They must receive reparations. Third, they want formal control over the Strait of Hormuz. Fourth, Iran's ballistic missile program must be completely free from any negotiation restrictions. These 4 points are almost entirely in conflict with the red line set by the US and Israel before the war. Senior officials from Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs they told CBS News in the US that they have already received messages from the US through mediators. However, their stance hasn't softened at all. Some analysts believe that this hardline attitude comes from the rapid rise in influence of the Revolutionary Guard, as well as the rise to power of the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei. Afterwards, internally, uncertainty remains, but the mainstream narrative within Iran's regime is still one of resilience. Any concession to the US could trigger the collapse of the regime from within. Therefore, Iran's negotiation strategy isn't about seeking peace, but rather about stalling for time and waiting for changes. They're betting that Trump won't be able to withstand the surge in oil prices, domestic political pressure, and the risks of the midterm elections for long. Against this backdrop, analysts from all sides are not optimistic about the prospects of US-Iran negotiations. Denis Sternovich, a senior researcher at Israel's Institute for National Security Studies, posted on the X platform where he listed the key points of the current situation. He said, first of all, although both sides may have already exchanged indirect messages, substantial negotiations have yet to begin. Second, there is a huge gap between the positions of both sides. Iran believes it holds the upper hand and is demanding security guarantees and compensation for damages. Third, Trump seems to have overestimated the decision-making power of figures like the Iranian parliament speaker. The real power, the actual authority, is concentrated in the hands of the Revolutionary Guard. Fourth, he said, he believes that unless the United States makes major concessions, the chances of a breakthrough in the short term are very low. Fifth, even if an agreement is reached, it is very likely that it will not meet Israel's security needs. Sixth, control over the Strait of Hormuz is even more of a core political issue. There is absolutely no way Iran will back down on this. Nishan Larinovich finally summed up by saying that Trump might extend this ultimatum, but as the deadline approaches, this strategic dilemma will only intensify. His analysis is quite popular on social media. Many people agree, and one of the louder opinions is that Iran's hardline stance isn't just for show, it's an instinct for the regime's survival. If Trump tries to rush things, it will only let the other side take advantage. Right now, there is a consensus that the prospects for negotiations are bleak, and military pressure remains the decisive factor. What's interesting is that I saw reports saying that Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries clearly believe Trump shouldn't back down. The latest report comes from the New York Times. It revealed that Saudi Arabia's actual Saudi leader, Crown Prince Salman, has spoken with Trump several times over the past week. The message conveyed by the Crown Prince is that they must aim to destroy Iran's hardline regime. He is pushing for the Crown Prince's position. Iran poses a long-term threat to the Gulf region. Only by overthrowing the current government can this threat be completely eliminated. And now is a historic moment to overthrow this government. Analysts believe that the Crown Prince originally hoped to avoid war. But since war is already broken out, if Trump backs down now, the Gulf states will be forced to face an even tougher and angrier Iran on their own. A half-hearted offensive would leave Saudi Arabia and other countries exposed. Under frequent attacks, it could also allow Iran to retain the ability to occasionally shut down the Strait of Hormuz. The Crown Prince has even argued that the United States should consider sending troops into Iran. to seize energy infrastructure and force the government to step down. Of course, both sides are worried that if the conflict drags on, Iran might launch even more destructive attacks on the oil facilities of Gulf countries, and the United States could get caught in, and endless more. And these are considered risks, not things that are certain to happen, but risks that need to be taken into account. However, more and more conservatives are also warning that a hasty withdrawal carries especially significant risks. I saw a British nobleman and historian born in Canada. This lord, Conrad Black, that is, Lord Conrad Black, published an article in the New York Sun. An article, the headline reads, "Trump knows that peace in the Middle East depends on ending Iran's radicalism." Blake, using the Vietnam War as an example, believes that history shouldn't repeat itself. Retreating halfway through a war that could have been won. Retreating midway ended up bringing humiliation to the United States and resulted in failure to achieve its strategic goals. He believes that Trump will not adopt the Vietnam-era approach of declaring victory and then withdrawing troops. What kind of pattern? He pointed out that the US-led coalition has already destroyed 90% of Iran's missile and drone capabilities. But if they stop here, Iran will claim victory in the Muslim world, because even though Iran's opponents achieved a sweeping victory on the battlefield, they still failed to destroy Iran, or significantly change the policies and goals of the Islamic Republic. In that case, the result would be that the Iranian people continue to suffer terribly. The tyrannical government would fully resume its missile armament program and restart its nuclear weapons military program. They would also claim that they have the ability to cut off the export of oil from the Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. For Trump, this is an outcome that is simply unacceptable. Lord Black believes that the leadership of radical Islam must be brought to an end, so that Iran can break away. Only then, with the Beijing and Moscow camps, can lasting peace come to the Middle East and Trump be recognized as one of America's outstanding presidents. In addition, former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich also wrote that this is a historic turning point for the entire world. He said he has observed the resilience of Iran's dictatorial regime, which far exceeds expectations and has a much deeper base of support. He pointed out that the number of missiles possessed by Iran's dictatorial regime, it seems they have more than we imagined, possibly because they've hidden more production facilities, or maybe it's both. Their sustained ability to bomb America's allies is truly surprising. In addition, 2 missiles landed near Israel's nuclear research center. That was also shocking. Firing missiles with a range of 2,000 miles into the Indian Ocean is already enough to threaten Europe. And during the war, their continued execution of protesters also shows the current Iranian leadership's strong determination to survive. On the other hand, after this dictatorship killed more than 30,000 protesters, it became extremely difficult to inspire the people to rise up and overthrow the regime again. Gingrich said that Trump shifted from a 48-hour ultimatum to a 5-day ceasefire. These 5 days of negotiations are crucial. Additionally, if the Strait of Hormuz is opened during the talks, then that's a small victory for Trump. If it remains closed, then it's a big win for Iran. He emphasized that the final outcome must be the establishment of a new Iranian government that has the support of the people. Any compromise that fails to completely dismantle the dictatorship is unacceptable. It would only give the other side more time to prepare for the next war. And the Iranian dictatorship will learn even more lessons from the battles in 2025 and 2026, making them even more dangerous and harder to defeat, he said. This is a turning point in world history. I also read about Iranian-American expert Saeed Ghassemi-Nejad in Iran. In an article published in the Jerusalem Post, he said this: Trump's war depends on the United States stopping the Iranian regime from rebuilding, according to the article. He warned that if Washington is satisfied with a superficial change that leaves the Revolutionary Guard and the ideological apparatus untouched, then this operation would only be a pause, not a solution. Here, he uses the word pause, just like Kim Yoon-ki did. They especially emphasize that the political center of Iran has already shifted into exile. Crown Prince Pahlavi said that Pahlavi's legitimacy lies in this transformation. Ignoring this key to success will only create a legitimacy deficit and spark a new round of turmoil. The article urges the United States not to monopolize the political endgame. Israel should be deeply involved. It should be a true dismantling, not just recycling the old system. Finally, I want to talk about the views of historian Professor Hansen. This is also the most thought-provoking point at the moment. In his latest video, Professor Hansen gets straight to the point in his analysis. He says, by all traditional military metrics, Iran is already finished. They have no navy, no air force, and no missile defense. Their army is useless, and their missile and drone stockpiles are depleted. Only about 10% remain. The US and Israel have complete air superiority and can even deploy A-10 attack aircraft and Apache helicopters at low altitude. However, one of his core warnings is that tactical success does not equal strategic victory. He gives the example that back in the day, Napoleon almost won every battle against Russia. He even captured Moscow, but had no plan to force the Tsar to abdicate. In 1941, the German army won every engagement on the outskirts of Moscow, but they didn't have a strategic solution. The US won every battle in Iraq and Afghanistan, but similarly lacked a plan for a strategic endgame. So in the end, every one of those wars was a strategic failure. He said that Iran's current strategy is very simple. They believe Trump is only temporary. Of the past 7 presidents, 6 have dealt with variables arising in Iran. After launching attacks, they did nothing. What Iran is betting on is simply outlasting Trump's term, protecting the oil revenue from Card Island, and waiting for Russia, North Korea, and China to resupply them. Any fissile material that hasn't been destroyed will eventually become a nuclear bomb, and next time they plan to use that bomb. So Professor Hansen said this, Trump's 5-point agenda includes destroying Iran's missile capabilities. It also includes eliminating their air superiority, wiping out their navy, stopping their nuclear program, and rebuilding, and also creating conditions for regime collapse. These 5 points may seem coherent. The key is that you can't directly push for regime change unless you send in ground troops. And he said, in this situation, under 3 circumstances, Trump would stop. One is that Iran runs out of viable targets to strike, or the US needs to conserve its arsenal to deal with a possible Chinese invasion. Taiwan believes that this arsenal is all very insufficient. Or it could be that oil prices skyrocket, or the political pressure becomes too great. So once the US stops, is there a chance that the Iranian people could overthrow this regime? That's an unknown. Professor Hansen says this regime is fully aware of all this. That's why they're still resisting. They'll lie, steal, and kill to maintain their grip on power. Because once they're out of power, they'll be held accountable for their crimes against the Iranian people. I think Professor Hansen really pinpointed the crux of the issue, but he doesn't have an answer either. My own view is that military success doesn't necessarily mean strategic victory. So this time, regarding America's actions toward Eileen, what is the strategic objective? If it's not to change the nature of the Iranian regime, then none of the other goals are really possible. It can't truly succeed because if it's still the same kind of radical regime as before, this Iranian regime under the Islamic Republic is just old wine in a new bottle. It will definitely restart its missile and nuclear weapons development. And at the same time, it will certainly crack down on its people even more brutally. Iran's control over the Strait or its threat to the region will only grow. In a few years, it could even recover militarily or become even stronger. So everything the US and Iran are doing today is just postponing the ultimate threat by a few years, or maybe even less, just like Jin Liqi said. As Chang said, if the nature of the regime doesn't change, then a ceasefire is just a pause. However, trying to contain Iran's development in the future will only get harder and harder. The Chinese talk about the right timing, geographical advantage, and unity of people. Only when all these factors come together can there be today's blow against Iran. Just like the Saudi crown prince said, this is a historic moment. This is an opportunity that won't come again. There won't be another Trump in the future. And Netanyahu won't stay in power forever either. Once Iran gets its hands on nuclear weapons, the international community will have no choice but to find ways to deal with it. Coexisting with them will only make the evil axis of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea even stronger. The whole world will be shrouded under their threats and coercion. Now, today, Trump said that right now. The people they're talking to now are a different group, not the same as before. In a way, this is also a form of regime change, right? I think this actually shows that Trump is very clear about this. When it comes to the Iran issue, regime change is the best solution. But just because the people are different, does that mean it's a different regime? Of course not. Deng Xiaoping was different from Mao Zedong, but it was still the same communist regime. But then, what kind of different people are we really talking about? Let's say, hypothetically, if it wasn't the Revolutionary Guard, but rather the opposing faction to the Revolutionary Guard, would that really lead to, would something actually happen then? Would that count as a kind of regime change? Because the policies, ideas, and goals would be different. So, who exactly is the opposing faction to the Revolutionary Guard? Let me throw out a possibility here. The Iranian regular army has always been a counterpart to the Revolutionary Guard. There are deep-seated conflicts between them and the regular army. By its very nature, it belongs to the state, not to the mullah regime. So if someone or some force emerges within the regular army and tries to find a way to negotiate with the United States, could it be that would that become the completely different person Trump talked about? And if it's not the hardliners, I think that's the only way to explain why Iran would send the US what Trump called a big gift. If it were the hardliners, the Revolutionary Guard, or even the current supreme leader or the Speaker of Parliament, they're all hardliners. They gave the US, gave Trump a huge oil and gas gift. I think this is really hard to imagine unless the US is actually negotiating with the opposing faction of these hardliners. Other than the Revolutionary Guard, of course, I don't really know much about Iran's internal affairs either. I just think it's possible that it's something that happens within the defense force, some power. I know what everyone thinks. Do you think the United States is negotiating? The Trump team is negotiating this power. So what kind of people are these folks, really? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Of course, no matter who they are, even if they're showing a certain degree of this willingness to negotiate or a softened attitude. So will this group of people really lead Iran down a different path? It's still too early to say. Because the Iranian regime is still very different from the Venezuelan regime. It carries this kind of extreme religious ideology, and that determines its internal personnel. Its hardline stance and anti-human values are extremely difficult to change. I think that trying to find someone from within, someone like the Venezuelan vice president, is really unlikely. But we can't say it's impossible. So all of this, how should I put it? Until the truth is actually revealed, all we can do is speculate. Speaking of regime change, there's something I want to mention. Is it really the case that if the US truly wants to push for regime change, or even sends in ground troops, it will definitely get stuck in a quagmire of war? I think it's probably not that simple, because I think Iran's current situation is quite unique in some ways. For one thing, the will of the Iranian people is very clear, as seen from the protests by the Iranian public over the years. From the nationwide street protests and massacres at the beginning of the year, the Iranian people have already shown. They have shown a powerful public will, even willing to sacrifice their lives, refusing to be ruled by this brutal regime any longer. Secondly, Iran currently has a crown prince, Reza Pahlavi, living in exile. This provides the most ready-made transitional solution. No matter how much the opposition groups in Iran may disagree with each other, the Crown Prince offers the greatest possibility, overthrowing the mullah's rule and moving toward democracy and freedom, letting the people decide who will ultimately be the leader. And Iranians have also shown their support for the Crown Prince in various public statements. As analyzed by Saeed in his article in the Jerusalem Post, he said that earlier this year, when the exiled Crown Prince called for nationwide protests, millions responded. This was not something that happened spontaneously, but rather the result of years of accumulation. It was the result of trust. It was also because no one else in the country holds the same level of influence. Ignoring this reality won't bring stability. It'll only create friction or even worse consequences. So he is urging the Trump team not to ignore this. So what's the reality? Third, I think what's really different about the current situation is that the Iranian regime is at its most vulnerable moment right now. Whether it's militarily, economically, or in terms of social control, there's no need to elaborate on that. The fourth point is that with the United States and Israel's military strength, plus the Gulf countries now showing a clear willingness to eliminate the threat posed by Iran's radical regime, even if the United States actually sends troops into Iran, it won't be fighting alone. I think Israel and the Gulf countries would join forces in combat. In addition, there are also local armed forces within Iran. For example, the Kurds. Even if the National Defense Army really sides with the United States, the National Defense Army could be incorporated into their ranks. So, in that case, the US military force should be, even if they go in at first, they should be able to gradually withdraw pretty quickly. Of course, everything depends on how the current negotiations play out. If the negotiations ultimately fail, then even if the US doesn't send troops into Iran, there's the issue of sending troops to seize islands because it's essential to keep the Strait of Hormuz open. So, at the very least, troops would need to be deployed to control some of the islands in the Strait of Hormuz. This would be a limited operation. But these actions themselves are actually quite complicated. And once it starts, both the risks and the scope of the operation could expand. So, even if the islands are occupied, there are still issues. Ultimately, there's the question of how to withdraw, how to pull out. So for the US, it's about fighting these wars of attrition around the periphery. Or should they go straight for the jugular and aim to overthrow the regime? Which one would drag on longer and be more difficult? If negotiations break down, I think these are also things the Trump administration would consider. All right, that's all for negotiations. Next, I just want to quickly share some of my thoughts. Recently, Tucker Carlson interviewed a Professor Zhang. Is he really a professor? I don't know, but all mine sources say he is. He graduated from Yale and used to be a middle school teacher in Shenzhen. I'll just talk about the content of their interview. You could say that Mr. Zhang's framework is quite grand. It's about the petrodollar system, geopolitics, Israel's ultimate conspiracy, and so on. It all sounds pretty impressive, but after listening to this interview, I feel like there are a few main issues. First, his assessment of the consequences of a war with Iran. He thinks this war will last for years, several years, and says the US will get bogged down in a quagmire. But this judgment is based on an assumption. That is, the Iranian regime has the ability to resist to the end and keep the US tied up, while the US is unable to. Withdraw, and the conflict will just continue. But why does the Iranian regime have the ability to hold out to the end? Why wouldn't it fail, or have a regime change, or reach an agreement with the US? Would the Gulf countries just stand by and watch this happen? Professor Zhang doesn't give any explanation. He just makes this assumption. That's what he thinks. That's just the way it is. So I think this assumption is what everything is based on. But if this assumption doesn't hold, then all of his predictions will fall apart. So the second issue is with his viewpoint. The second problem is with his perspective. His arguments are all extremely black and white, oversimplified. For example, he says Iran can control the Strait of Hormuz and charge fees. He claims that Iran is capable of doing this. Then he says that in 10 to 20 years, Iran will become strong again because of this. The US will withdraw from the Middle East, and Middle Eastern countries will cut ties with the US. It's almost all conclusions, but there's hardly any reasoning process. These are extremely simplistic conclusions, so that's why I say he's oversimplifying things. Third, he looks at issues in a static way. For example, he jumps straight from the Strait of Hormuz being blocked to saying that the global energy market or the economy will collapse. But the problem is, everything is constantly changing and developing. Now, Saudi Arabia has already opened up. Pipelines have been built so that the Yanbu port on the Red Sea now handles a third of the crude oil that used to be transported through the Strait of Hormuz. And Japan, after signing an agreement with the United States, will import large amounts of crude oil from Alaska to diversify its risk. Other global markets will also adjust as quickly as possible based on the situation. They won't be so dependent on the Middle East anymore. So in the long run, there will be a global restructuring of the entire framework. It won't be like he said, where just because of A, then B will automatically happen. And the most important point is that in his argument, there's no distinction between good and evil in this analysis. In his analysis, there's no criticism whatsoever of Iran's dictatorial regime, nor any sympathy for the Iranian people, or any analysis of whether Iran actually poses a threat to the world should the United States intervene. Actually, throughout Professor Zhang's remarks, both explicitly and implicitly, the message is that America is a failed empire. Israel, even if he doesn't outright call it evil, he still paints it as a schemer and the biggest beneficiary of war. So his stance is actually pretty clear. So you can't really say there's no sense of right and wrong. It's just that his sense of right and wrong is different from most people's. But when I heard a certain part in the middle, I was honestly shocked. Then the host Tucker asked him if he were the president of the United States, what would he do? Then Professor Zhang said, what I would do is gather everyone together, including Russia, China, and Iran. Bring everyone together, including them. Tell them that now is the time to establish a new world order. In this order, we are partners working together. What we want to do is start a dialogue where everyone is respected, so that America is no longer a bully, but instead becomes a victorious partner in creating a new order, so that everyone benefits. He could say, I think this is the wisest advice. All right, hearing this, I can hardly listen to this guy anymore. He suggests that the US should work with China and Russia to establish a new world order. And the US should admit it's been a bully and then stop being one. Then, under this kind of order, everyone would benefit. Wow, I mean, of course, I'm not going to waste time refuting this. I mean, where is this even coming from? This is even more of a spokesperson than the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson. And Tucker actually said this was the wisest suggestion. I feel like today's Tucker is completely unrecognizable compared to 2 years ago. I have no idea what happened. Anyway, that's just my take. I won't say much more about this. I don't know if any of you have watched Professor Zhang's videos. And if you have seen his videos and have any thoughts on his views, you're welcome to share them. Feel free to leave a comment below our show. So before we wrap up this episode, I want to share some good news with everyone. Shenyang performances are currently underway. This is the Shenyang Global Tour for 2026. It's happening in major cities and states all across the country. So right now, at this very moment, Shenyang is on stage. Every season, they debut an entirely new program with fresh dances and music. It truly takes you on a journey. You'll travel through China's magnificent history and awaken memories deep within your heart. You could say it's a feast for both the eyes and the soul, an experience that's truly uplifting. It's a wonderful treat to enjoy with family and friends. Right now, Shenyang is performing across major continents. For example, this April, there are shows in Tokyo, Japan, and starting this week through early April, there are also performances at Lincoln Center in New York. The shows will run for 2 to 3 weeks. So if you're in the New York or New Jersey area, be sure to check for tickets as soon as possible. And for friends in other places, you can also check as soon as possible. Go to the Shenyang website to look up performances in cities near where you live. If you buy tickets on Shenyang's official website, you can use mine. Exclusive promo code FangFei2026. This will waive the ticketing service fee for shows in the US. All right, thank you all so much for watching. I still hope you can like, subscribe, and share to help promote our show. Thank you. We'll see you next time.